Un, deux. Hi everyone, my name is Philippe. Thanks to be here. I suppose it has been a long day. How many people went to attend Vlad's presentation? Yeah, quite a lot of people. And how many understood at least 80% of it? Okay. So there are two people probably that will get bored by my presentation, and the other one maybe you'll find it interesting or entertaining. So I'm an entrepreneur, and I'd like to give you a bit of background about why I'm talking about governance today. A few years ago, I was running a company named Ftopia, and we decided to transform it into an open community. So we decided to change the way we were working in order to transform a traditional startup with its usual, management and investors and the way to do business as usual into an open community with no hierarchy, with no managers. And it was more a thought experiment than a real experiment, but that was the goal that we had, and it was called a free Ftopia. See, there are some people that were part of the experiment here. And so doing so, we faced a lot of questions, many questions actually, like how do we organize the work that is to be done? How do we pay the people? Who will decide how much people will be paid? What is the priority for the roadmap? Who is deciding which kind of marketing campaign we will launch? And who will be part of the decision-making process? Like, for instance, do we include customers or just people who directly contribute? And also question like, who will decide and how we will decide about the way to decide, right? So all kind of questions that actually you don't ask yourself, you don't have this problem when you run a traditional company because there are people that are in charge of making decisions. We haven't clearly found a model, but the result of that and what I take from this experiment and that I'm going to reuse throughout this presentation is inspired from Lawrence Lessig, pathetic dot theory, for those who know that. It says that there are four main sources of constraint over our behavior as individuals. One is the law, one is the code or the architecture, which is what is given by our environment, and one is the social norms, and the last one is the market, which is governed by supply and demand and price discovery. So these are the four main constraints that are actually playing on our behavior, and this is actually four main constraints for governance as well. So we'll see that throughout the presentation. And the other point that I want to make is that governance is complex. This is dynamic. This is a process. It's not something that we can solve in one or defined or predefined formal model. So formal models are actually useful for governance, but we believe, and I believe, that we have to play with the models because they are never capable of solving the entirety of governance problem. And with that, let me start with the agenda. So I will go first through what is governance, and then we'll see governance in the context of blockchains, public blockchains, very quickly, obviously. And then governance in token-based economy. My talk is entitled, Which Governance for My Tokens? And so I will finish with a specific case, which is the way we see token-based governance in the project that I'm working on right now, which is called Tribute. So first, what is governance? Could the people who think that they have a very clear idea of what is governance raise their hand? Okay, so it seems that there are actually not a very clear understanding of what is the term. for most people, and this is quite normal. Actually, it's quite a fuzzy concept. There are actually several ways to define governance. I'll start with a very simple one, which is extracted from the Oxford dictionaries, and it says that it's basically the act, the action of or the manner of governing, right? So you have a government, or you have a king. I think that there is an example of the king here. Yeah. And the action of governing, or the manner of governing, is the governance itself. So it has something to do with the power, right? The king has the power. However, governance is not management. So in the context of a corporation, in the context of a business organization, power within the company is applied by the management and the hierarchy within the company. And there is a big difference between governance and management. What is said generally is that the management is about executing a strategy. So let's think, for instance, about the CIO, the Chief Information Officer of a company. He's in charge of the IT strategy. He may suggest plans for the IT strategy or for the IT department. They may be approved by the executive committee, let's say, or the CEO, and then he will go and apply this strategy. And the same for the CEO, who will defend his own strategy before the board of directors. So it's about executing more than about the goal itself. Governance is about the goal. Governance is about making sure that all the processes are in place in order to reach a goal. And the processes might be people. That's why there are governance procedures for naming executive people, for instance. And it might be the processes for controlling that actually the trajectory of the organization is going towards the goal. One goal can be the self-perpetuation of the company, which is a condition for doing anything, but it's actually more complex than that, because there are many people that have their own goals and that influence the governance. So here, in the context of corporate governance, we can see the traditional stakeholders. Sorry about that. So on the left, you have the internal stakeholder, the board of directors, the executive management, and the employees. On the right, you have the external stakeholder, like the shareholders, the creditors, the suppliers, the banks, the customers, the community, the state. In France, it's often the state. So you have many people that actually are part of this governance process. And sometimes there are conflicts of interest and misalignment of interest, because all those stakeholders don't have the same goal, obviously. Governance is also about mitigating the conflict and the misalignment of interest. In Anglo-American companies, there is an emphasis on the importance of the shareholders, right? And there is a fiduciary duty, there is a very important duty of the executive management towards the shareholders. The executive management is in place in order to maximize the profit, maximize the value that is returned to the investors. This is why the board of directors in those companies are named by the shareholders. It's not the same case everywhere. For instance, in Germany, you have those companies where a part of the board of directors is named by the employees. Not all of them are named by the shareholders, which is interesting. It means that the role of the employees here is fundamental, and that in a way, the executive management report to the employees through the board. So yeah, so we can have tension and opposition between different type of stakeholders, and that's participate to the sort of governance that we have. So let's talk quickly about some governance failure. Some here may remember at the beginning of 2000, the 21st century, we had those very big scandals, and actually people started to talk a lot about corporate governance there then, when companies like Enron or WorldCom collapsed in a spectacular manner for an idea of that for people who were not aware. Enron was a company whose market cap was $60 billion, and it went away in a few weeks, basically. And their accounts were audited by Arthur Andersen, which was one of the big 5 audit firms at the time, and which was one of the most respectable audit firms in the industry with something like 80,000 auditors. They went down as well. It was because of corporate governance issues, like, for instance, the fact that the executive management cheated on the account in order to maximize their own revenue, because they were incentivized through a market mechanism so that the performance on the stock market was getting them a huge compensation. So that's very interesting because it was a market. You remember at the beginning I was talking about code, law, market, and social norms. The market was a way to incentivize the management to actually align their behavior on the interest of the shareholders. But doing that in a very greedy way, they actually destroyed the company. As a result, the solution, or what people thought was a solution, was brought by the law. And it was what was called then Sarbanes-Oxley regulation. That was a set of regulation that was very demanding in terms of control of the account, transparency also of the way the auditors were doing their job. And it was so demanding that actually a lot of companies stopped to go to IPO because of that. Fast forward in 2008, we have another corporate governance issue, and very mega one, I would say, with the 2008 crisis, obviously. And then it's not audit firms, but it's credit rating agencies that were accused, in a way, of having some kind of behavior that was suspicious, because at the same time they had different interests. At the same time they have the interest of having the banks or the insurance as their customers, but at the same time they were rating them, right? So that was an issue. What is interesting here, and my point here, is that actually we're moved from one way to deal with that kind of thing, which is through law, to another way, which is through code. Because it's kind of a consensus today to say that the Bitcoin was a sort of result of, or an effect of the crisis of 2008, or the adoption of a way that allow anyone to control his own money instead of having to rely on banks or corrupted government and corrupted financial institution. Which lead me to the governance for blockchain itself. So we have stakeholders as well in the blockchain environment, in the decentralized networks. They just don't have the same name. Of course, the main ones in a decentralized network like the Bitcoin are called the miners and the developers and the users, right? And the miners, they validate blocks, and the developers, they develop the software in order to validate blocks, and the user, they do whatever they need to do with the whole thing. And then you have other stakeholders, like the exchanges, for instance. And so there are possibly misalignment or alignment between those different people, the different stakeholders. And when we are going to talk about a governance crisis, generally, this is because we find misalignments between those people, like the block size issue with the Bitcoin, for instance, and the misalignment between miners and developers. But here, I'd like to tell you about something else that everyone heard about or know about. It's the DAO problem in 2016. So what is interesting in this event is actually the DAO was a governance system. It was actually on the website. You can see it here. Defines governance. DAO code defines governance. The idea of the DAO was to get rid of some governance problem by coding the way people would interact. The different stakeholders were investors, you might remember that the DAO was some kind of fund, but that was decentralized. And the investors were part of the system. And then there were companies or developers or teams that were willing to get the fund in order to develop their own software and contribute to the Ethereum community. And then there were some other stakeholders that were the curators, were making sure that the actual proposals from developers were legit, right? There was a hack, as you know, and the trust in the DAO vanished. What is interesting is what happened after. I took this from just, you know, a journalist, no one that is particularly aware of the detail and the intricacy of the issue at the time, but it was very interesting to see that. What she said was that the embezzlement, the theft of the funds was legal. It was legal because there were no agreement between the different people that were forming the DAO. If you look at the regular fund, you have contract between the fund managers and the LP and the limited partners, and you have as well contract between the fund and each company they invested in. But in this case, there were no contract. The only contract was the code. So basically, if there were someone stealing through the code, then it was legal. Okay, fine. But then in the next sentence, what she says is, it was just at the time the hack was discovered, meaning that there were this locking period of 30 days, and the funds were still locked. So people were hoping to get it before the period was finished. And so she was saying the Ethereum community has less than a month to decide what to do. But what is it to be done? It's in the code, right? So the only thing that the Ethereum community possibly could do was breaking the code. But you cannot do anything else than that. And that's exactly what happened. And there was the fork, and there was what is called a governance crisis in the Ethereum community that actually led to 2 different Ethereum communities. So that's a governance crisis because there was a dissensus, there was a fight around the goals. For one of the constituent, for a part of the people in the community, the most important goal, or one of the most important goals of the Ethereum project was immutability. And for them, if you change the ledger, then you could as well trash everything, right? Because this is a critical goal that is attacked. And for the other one, which became the Ethereum that we know, it's actually not true. Immutability is important, but it could come second compared to security, for instance, because having someone that have 10% of all the Ether at the time could be a problem of security, or it could be second to ethics. So one question that has been posed and that I've been asked repeatedly at the time and since then is, could all of this mess have been solved through code? So instead of having to fork, would it be possible to actually modify the, for instance, block the funds or change the software, change the protocol in a way that is inside the protocol? And that's about self-upgradable ledgers and self-upgradable protocols. So that's what is called as well on-chain governance, right? So you have projects, we have projects today like Tezos or Dfinity that are precisely about that. They offer ways, or they want to deliver ways for a protocol to be upgraded depending on the vote of the people who use the protocol. And you have another way to see the whole issue in the Ethereum community and in the Bitcoin community. And what is prevailing as an opinion is that off-chain governance is very important, actually, and it's part of the resilience of the protocol to have off-chain process, meaning that it's not on the blockchain. for a number of reasons. So for the people interested, I recommend the articles of course, Vitalik and Vlad on the subject, and Primavera de Filippi. Recently, an article called No Blockchain is an Island. There are very good explanations of why it's important to actually rely on something else than the code in order to define the governance. Let's go through governance of token-based economies now. So it's a bit different because blockchain projects are not public blockchain, actually, except some public blockchain that are centralized. But most of the public blockchain that are not centralized are open, and you have problems like Sybil attacks, for instance, that you don't have in most projects that are using the blockchain in order to deliver some kind of application, some kind of dApps, for instance. If you look at the stakeholders in the blockchain project, it's actually quite different from the one that we were seeing for a public blockchain. And it looks like traditional corporate governance, right? You have CEO of a project that go through an ICO, for instance. You have CEO, you have the CTO, the CMO, the C whatever, all you want. You have a hierarchy, you have employees. Even investors, traditional investors and VCs that actually invest before the sale, the token sale. And then you have the usual suspect, the customer, the supplier. Actually, the infrastructure can be seen as a supplier. So when a dApp or a company, an organization that uses the blockchain for a blockchain project relies on Ethereum, for instance, there is a market interface between this organization and the infrastructure. It's called gas, right? There is a new kid on the block here, which is the investor. That's kind of funny, because the public investor, normally you don't have them in a startup. You have them in very big company that went through an IPO. But now with the fantastic thing that is called an ICO, we can have public investors in a very small project like a blockchain project. But then it creates some new potential for misalignment and for tension. As you know, there is this weird thing that we have in the ICO. It's that as an investor, and as a disclaimer, I'm an investor in some ICOs. So as an investor, you buy tokens, but tokens that are, in most cases, supposed to be utility token. So you buy the right to use a service later. And most of the investors don't buy it because they want to use it. They buy it because they think that the price is going to rise and that they're going to make money out of it. But it's not like a traditional share. It's not like being in a round of a startup, a seed round. It's not like you are a business angel. You have no shares. You have no right. You have no voice. You have absolutely no influence on the internal stakeholder. So the internal stakeholder get the money, get the Ether, get the Bitcoin, and they even get some token, new token, but they don't have any accountability towards the investor. That's what is one of the problems of the ICO. So what keeps them actually doing what they said they will be doing? It's kind of interesting, a corporate governance issue, right? How do you make sure that there is an accountability? How do you make sure that the company is actually doing and delivering what they said they will do if there's actually no change for them? They already got the money. They already got the investment. Well, this is generally the reason why there is a part of the token that is allocated to the management team and to the company, so that their interests are aligned to the ones of the investors. But generally, it's very little compared to all the Ether that they got, especially when the Ether went up. Actually, this is why I put, again, this little icon here of the social norms. The reason why we don't have so many scams, we have a lot of scams, but actually not so many of them, it's because we share in the community some social norms that it's actually not right to take the money and run, right? And there is the law, but it's toothless for the moment, but it's coming on the one that are not doing their job. So there has been different ways to actually solve the problem or suggest solution. And they use law like the foundation system, or they use code, like the DAICO. So one minute on each of them. Foundation is actually a trick that is legal. It's a law system, an agreement system. So the idea is that you're going to create a new vehicle and put the fund in the vehicle, and the people in charge of this vehicle won't be the same that the one in charge of the company that triggered the whole ICO in the first place. Aragon did that very recently in a very interesting manner. They said that they want to grow an ecosystem around their technology, and they want to make sure that even companies that have ideas that are competing with what they do could be actually supported within the ecosystem. Hence the foundation that will have funds to help the companies that may compete against Aragon but on the same technology. That's good, but it's also a problem because it's centralized. It's not decentralized at all. It's a traditional organization. And if things goes wrong, like you've maybe heard about the Tezos problem with their foundation, then you can have a locking of the funds and the whole thing goes wild. The other thing is the DAICO, so decentralized autonomous initial coin offering. So the idea is more or less to reuse the DAO mechanism so that instead of getting the fund right away, the people who raised an ICO get the fund depending on the milestone, and the investors actually vote on the release of the fund, which is kind of cool, except that it's not legal, right? Because the DAO is not legal, and it's exactly the same thing. So there are issues also in terms of legal aspect, and also in terms of participation. We know by experience, including with the DAO, that people don't participate to the voting. They invest, but then they stop being interested. So that's another issue with this kind of system. And getting slightly late, so I'm going to speed up a little bit with the last part, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our project and how we see a possible way to organize the governance a bit differently moving forward when we have decentralized ecosystem. So what we're doing is called Tribute, and the general idea is that it's equity for your community. The general idea is that we create contributive tokens that an organization can use in order to share the value of what they produce with their contributors, so non-employees, people that are outside the company, and together, you know, it's like everything is ecosystem today. We have company, but every company works with volunteers, with freelance, with independent workers, with advisors, with, you name it, partners, consultants. So the idea is that the overall value that is created by a company is actually the result of every contribution, and not only the people inside. People inside, we have instruments in order to incentivize them on the future value. It's called stock options. But we don't have that kind of thing for people outside, and that's what Tribute want to solve. So the general system is this. So in the middle layer here is the organization, and the organization rewards external contributors using tokens when some job is actually done, right? And at the bottom layer, you have Tribute, which is itself on the same model with a core team and a community of contributors. The business model of the system is that it's not a SaaS model. We don't have a subscription model. Instead, we are a contributor as well of every organization. So if an organization issues some tokens using our system to pay their contributors, then they issue as well the same token for paying the platform. And we're becoming a whole complete ecosystem through this process. As a result, we introduce what is called here a token swap, meaning that every time we receive a token from a new organization, we issue a governance token for this organization, so that the organization itself has a say, has a voice in the governance of the ecosystem. The goal is to actually mirror, to match two different realms One is the realm of the code with the DAO, and the second one is the realm of the legal form of a company. And for that, we are contemplating the use of a very specific form of cooperative called public benefit cooperative. It's a French form of cooperative that has been created recently in 2001, I believe. So the idea here is that we have three groups of shareholders that are stakeholders, the main stakeholders, organization, contributors, and the core team. And there's no group that owns the majority of the shares. So the core team, or the startup, if you want, that is Tribute, cannot control the main parameters of the ecosystem. From the ground up, it's designed to be decentralized through a legal governance. The other thing that is important is that there is a duty to the network, a fiduciary duty to the network, and not to maximizing the value for the shareholders. And that's part also of the status of public benefit cooperative. And the last thing is that by nature is multi-stakeholder governance, meaning that there is a cooperative style governance within each group of shareholders, like a democratic governance. Each person has one voice. But then, this is grouped at the level of the stakeholder. So if you have, I don't know, like 1 million person in one stakeholder group and 10 in another one, then it won't change the balance between the different stakeholder group, right? And with that, thank you. I think I'm a bit late for a question.